3 charged and more to come. We'll talk about the latest in the Flint water investigation and the challenges for families living with autism. Today is Sunday, April 24th, 2016, and this is Flashpoint.
All right, welcome to Flashpoint. We're going to start this morning in slightly different fashion. Right off the top, let's get up to date with a big week in the Flint water crisis. The first round of criminal charges coming down from the defenders. Kevin Dietz is here. Kevin, we saw 3 people charged this week. There were some criticisms immediately that these were mid-level bureaucrats that are somehow really absolving higher-ups. But this is just the start. They couldn't have gone to many more lengths to say that.
Yeah, and I think these people had a key role in what went wrong in Flint. These were the people who were taking the samples. These were the people who were supposed to let the public know if there was a problem. And these were the people that didn't do that. They had evidence that led them to warn people that the water was not safe, and that's not what they did.
Well, in fact, we've had this debate as to whether negligence in your job somehow rises to criminality, or just not particularly doing your job all that well. I think these charges suggest that there's more than negligence going on. This was active criminal behavior.
Yeah, and the key is really in these 2 documents right here. One was said that they had to collect 100 samples and that they collected 71 samples. But then they doctored it, they changed it, they scrubbed it, and they said, we're only going to do 60 samples, and we're going to use 69 that we collected. So they threw out the 2 highest samples. If those 2 samples had stayed, they would have, by law, had to warn everyone in Flint not to drink the water. You throw those 2 out, they didn't have to warn anyone, and they didn't.
That's what as I was hearing all this boiled down to 2 water samples that would have changed the course of all of this?
Yes, everyone would have been warned a year earlier, way earlier. Everyone would have been warned. They would have got off the Flint River, they would have gone back to Detroit, and then we'd be where we are trying to figure it out, but people would not have drank that water.
Now, one thing that was really important to remember is not only is the Attorney General just getting started, he said there's a lot more going on, there are other investigations taking place as well. This isn't the only one.
Right. There's a federal investigation, a county investigation, so there's multiple investigations. The investigators are all working together, and we're hearing that they're looking at over 20 people being charged before this is all done. So, yeah, they have 3 charged. They're just getting started.
I guess the question for a lot of people, though, is the governor likely to be one of those people? Does that feel like a possibility at this stage?
I think it is a possibility. It depends on what the folks who have been charged now say. Will they say that they notified their bosses that there was lead in the water, and then did their bosses notify the governor's office, and did the chief of staff tell the governor, and if so, when?
Great scene setter, Kevin. Thanks very much. Appreciate it. We'll start there with this morning's roundtable today on Flashpoint. Let's start things off with this morning's roundtable now. Head of the Detroit Civil Rights Division, Portia Roberson, is back with us. Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Dingell is here. And on the other side of the table, a double dose of the Detroit News, Daniel House and Nolan Finley. Congresswoman, let me start with you. This is just the start. And as Kevin mentioned, we have a number of investigations going on as well, including federal. Where do you get the sense all of this is headed?
What I want is the facts. I think that the FBI and the U.S. Attorney are doing an investigation. I think it will be an objective, in-depth investigation. And I'm waiting for the facts, and I'm not going to make speculation until those that have the responsibility to do it complete it.
There's an old adage, never appear on Capitol Hill if you can help it in an election cycle. We saw during some of those hearings in Washington, we saw, I think you'd have to say, a little bit of grandstanding on the part of some, and even some others now criticizing Bill Schuette, who they see as, I always joke that AG stands for aspiring governor. How concerned are you about the politicization of this process?
How concerned? Very. Anybody who knows me now, I've said point blank, I'm tired of everybody playing politics. I want to get the problem solved. We need to stop playing to sound bites and start to work together and get the people of Flint what they need.
Nolan, where do you think all this is going?
Well, I think, what we saw this week is a flushing out. And so you charge...
To use a water term.
Right.
Yeah.
You charge these 3 people, and you send sort of a warning shot across the rest of the bureaucracy saying, if you know something, and Bill Schuette, Andy Arena, all but said that. If you know something, now's the time to come forward. What did Andy Arena say? There's those who get on the train early get the best seats. And so I think the purpose of these early indictments, rather than waiting and doing 20 at once, if you will, was to flush others out, to get people to come forward and tell what they know, to avoid this sort of prosecution themselves.
This is really not going to type. You know, some people talk this week about a lot of instances we've seen both at the federal and the state and even local levels of government failing, and nobody's held accountable. And I think a lot of people don't expect that nobody's going to be held accountable. And I get the impression, as Debbie said, I get the impression that you're going to see a lot of people held accountable here. Clearly, this is only the beginning. I think the feds are going to be involved, and I would say I wouldn't rule anybody out based upon the way in which, and we spent a lot of time with the Detroit News, as other organizations have, yours have, looking at these documents, and there's a lot of people whose fingerprints are on it.
Kevin said he wouldn't be surprised, Portia, if he saw 20 or more people indicted in all this, which I think kind of changes we keep calling this a failure of government. That's a different thing. If you've got 20 people criminally liable for something, that's more than sloppiness.
Yeah, it's definitely more than sloppiness. I first want to say I mean I agree with Congresswoman Dingell, because the reality of it is we still need to stay focused on helping the people of Flint, and I think we sometimes get away from that, and there are people that are still suffering, they're still drinking out of filters that don't work and still drinking out of bottled water and don't have the resources they need. And I know the mayor of Flint has said that, you know, we want to make sure the focus stays on that. On the other side, I think, you know, this week was a start, but it certainly is not the finish. I think you know, in looking at some of the text messages that have come out, I think there are emails that have come out rather, I think there have been indications that people higher up knew, and whether they said something to the governor or not still remains to be seen, but there's certainly some strong indications that people knew what was going on and for whatever reasons didn't tell, or may have been hesitant to tell who they should have told.
We've got an interesting liability issue here, Congresswoman. It's really difficult to sue your state for something like services that they're supposed to provide you. But if you can start showing criminality somewhere along the line, don't you have a better case? This could get really, really expensive.
It
already is.
It is going to be very expensive, because right now I want to focus on making the people of Flint safe. They need to have safe drinking water. We need to get the money spent. You know, I just learned this week, the federal government is sending money in, but they're not going to send any money until they see the state money actually going in to fixing the pipes, the Medicaid match. I didn't realize we're still caught up in a state legislature that's not matching it. Let's all stop playing games and let's start to get the problem fixed. That's what we need to do. And government at all levels did fail these people. Do you have people that were in the government that are going to be held liable for what happened? Yes. But government at all levels, and we need to make sure that there's never a climate again that what happened in Flint can happen in any city in America.
You know, it strikes me that I think it's incumbent on a lot of us who are involved in this to just call balls and strikes. If people want to really boil this down to Republican, Democrat, go after the governor, protect the governor. Let's just focus on what happened and be as nonpartisan as possible about it, because I think there were a lot of mistakes made by a lot of people. And I think one of the things about these indictments we saw this week is, for the first time, it went into the city of Flint. You know, the city of Flint has been kind of held harmless in a lot of this. That none of their people did anything wrong. Well, that's not true either.
Nolan, interesting ethical dilemma here as to who pays for the legal needs and services of state employees when they find themselves in trouble.
Well, if in a criminal case, I think the criminal pays, whether it's, you know, someone in the governor's office or someone in an agency. If you've committed a criminal act, you pay your own defense. If you're being sued as part of a broader lawsuit that involves the course of you doing your job, I think then the state pays. But I think it'll be interesting to see how this case is prosecuted. You know, did people just make mistakes? Did they just do bad work? Was it just incompetence or whatever? Or did they willfully do things that put people in danger? And I think every day people make mistakes on their jobs. It most often doesn't lead to the sort of tragedy we've seen in Flint. But how much intent is involved here? How much of this decision making or these actions were willful? I think it's going to be interesting to see how they prosecute it.
It's a good question, Portia. Is it against the law to be ineffective, clueless?
No.
I mean, because somewhere along the line, as Kevin said, here we're seeing active behavior of fudging numbers, changing documents, those sorts of things. Somewhere along the line, we're just going to have people that made a bad decision.
Correct. And I think, you know, making a bad decision is not criminal behavior. the issue I see is that this past week we saw 3 people charged because they had a conscious act to do something that was wrong. I'm not so sure there are not some higher ups who knew more, and the conscious act was deciding not to do anything at that point. And then that is the issue about whether or not that's criminal.
And
How
the higher
much
up
did you
the
know?
higher up the chain it goes, I think the easier it's going to bring charges. I mean, if you're
Again,
somebody who's
agreed.
in a position of protecting the public, and you know something and you don't inform the public, that could rise to the criminal.
Got to get to
I
a
agree.
quick break. We'll continue with this, and we'll also talk about where we are in the presidential race after New York. This is Flashpoint on Local 4. Welcome back. A few more thoughts on Flint before we move on to the presidential race. Congresswoman, you read it, the gesture that the governor's made to drink Flint water out of a filter. Does that mean anything? Is that an empty thing? What's going on there, do you suppose?
It's too little too late. He should have, the mayor told him to move to Flint in January, and I wish that he had. I don't believe that the governor of Flint deliberately poisoned the people. The governor of Michigan deliberately poisoned the people of Flint. I unfortunately think he's done one of the worst jobs I've ever seen in my lifetime of managing a crisis.
This crisis. Nolan, this idea of drinking Flint water, is that...
I think the time has passed for symbolic gestures and for gimmicks. I think what he needs to focus on and every day be messaging is, here's how we're fixing this. And I think he needs to be a lot stronger with the legislature and get that money going and get that money flowing. You know, I understand what he's trying to do. You've got to use the water. The water's, people have to turn those taps on to flush the system and get that coating through. Might be a better idea to just say, hey, for the next 3-4 days or week, we're not going to charge, we're turning the meters off. Just flush that water through.
When you're still
Leave
fighting
all your
over
type,
when you're still fighting over who's paying the bills.
Why are
asking
they
people
still
to turn the
paying
water
for
on.
poison water? It's inexcusable.
Well,
The stupid things they are doing are inexcusable.
If I didn't know better, I would think that somebody on his PR management staff had it out for him, because he's been so bad since day one.
Well, it's all new. It's all new. He's changed everybody.
And those people, he needs to look and find out if there's somebody in there who really doesn't want him to be successful at managing this, because everything he's done has been a colossal failure.
I tell you what, let's move on now and talk about where we are in the presidential race. We come out of New York, Dan, do we know any more than we did before?
Yeah, I think so. I think Trump is got some momentum again. You know, it's interesting. Right after New York, he went to Indiana, of all places. I mean, I think he realizes, and he's talking. What did he call Governor Mike Pence? This fabulous governor. And I thought, oh, really? And I love your state. I'm thinking, you've never been in Indiana in your life. But you know, I think it's we're getting a little bit more clarity. But I think most people believe that there's still going to be a contested convention in Cleveland. And it's going to be very
Republican
interesting.
side. On the Democratic side, Congresswoman, we saw an interesting thing where Hillary Clinton really walloped Bernie Sanders in New York, except that Bernie Sanders won 49 of the 62 counties, and in fact he did better than Barack Obama did in New York back in 2008, but we seem clearer on the Democratic side now, don't we?
I think that the senator has taken a couple days off this week and has said, let's see how we do the next 8 contests. I think Democrats are Democrats, and we could be just as interesting at our convention as Republicans are going to be.
Gosh, I hope so.
But we all going to
somebody who has to cover it.
We have an ability to pull together, and we will ultimately.
Yeah. Where do you think we are, Dylan?
Well, I agree that Trump came out of New York with some momentum, but he's had momentum before and lost it. I think as long as this is a 3-man race, it's going to be hard for him to capture the nearly 60% of remaining delegates that he needs to get to 1237. And if he doesn't get to 1237 and goes to the convention, I think it's game over for him.
Portia, your thoughts?
Well, the fact that I had to think who was the third man when Nolan just said that makes me, a little sure that Trump is probably going to come out really going into their convention saying that he deserves to be the nominee, and I think that they're going to have to fight that out. On the Democratic side, I think that there'll be a continued battle for a little while. I don't think Senator Sanders is anywhere near ready to get out, and again, good, healthy debate right now will help to, make sure that Hillary is prepared for that race against Donald Trump.
One other thing I want to say, Senator Sanders has been great for Democrats because he's brought so many people and energized, and they do respect each other, and you will see them come together.
I don't know that those Sanders voters that he's brought in, those new young voters, nothing suggests that they'll stay and get enthusiastic about Hillary Clinton. You look at her negatives out this week, 55%. The only person in the presidential campaign with higher negatives is Donald Trump.
And in fact, that's why you don't think that there's anything wrong with the Republican leadership stripping the nomination out of Donald Trump's hands, especially if he doesn't have the delegates.
I mean, close but no cigar. You get there and you don't have 1237, you have not won the nomination. And the Republicans are not, I write this morning, Republicans are not obliged to commit suicide in Cleveland. He can't win. He'll lose colossally. Wow. Same poll, 2/3 of registered voters say we'd never vote for Trump. You're not obliged to put a candidate like that on your ballot.
Since 1860, you'd have to have a majority of Republican delegates to get the nomination. And in 1976, the last time you had a contested convention, Ronald Reagan had 1 million more votes than Gerald Ford, but he didn't have the delegates.
Didn't have the numbers.
He lost on the first ballot. He said, that's the rules, we're done.
It's going to be fascinating if that's how it works out. We'll see. Gang, thank you all very much for being here. We come back. This is Autism Awareness Month. Where does the state of Michigan stand in providing services to, unfortunately, a growing autistic population? This is Flashpoint on Local 4. We are coming to the end of April, which has been Autism Awareness Month. Let's talk about that with Dave Meter, the Vice Chairman and Chief Administrative Officer for DTE Energy, and the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Michigan, Brian Kelly. And Lieutenant Governor, if we could, let me quickly just ask you a question or two about Flint because of what's happened. You've been made sort of the point person for the governor in Flint. What was your reaction to the charges that came down this past week?
Well, the investigations, that work is critically important. I know that the Justice Department, the Attorney General, the state police, others are, in the Auditor General even, doing different investigations, critically important work. But really the focus and attention, my attention and focus, is on the recovery efforts, being there on the ground, trying to build a better type of future. So while I respect the work and I'm glad that people are working so hard at it, I just want to make sure that tomorrow is a little brighter than yesterday. Have
you gone back and sort of Monday morning quarterbacked your own behavior through all of this? You caught some heat for an email that seemed dismissive of a state representative's worries about Flint. Your thoughts on your own role in this?
Yeah, I've never been in the chain of command of the emergency manager. That's why I see so little involvement in terms of the record of being there. And so, and even that case, it's a matter of that was a case where a state representative was saying that something happened unbeknownst to the city council. So not dismissive
of the
issue
of governance.
Yeah. So it's not dismissive of the concern of what happened in Flint, but of the idea that the city council didn't understand that the switch was happening to the Flint River. But in any event, I mean, there's tons of focus on yesterday, but if people don't really work on the future, it's, we'll never get past it, and that's really where the attention and the focus needs to be.
As the Congresswoman said a few minutes ago. Let's move into the matter at hand, which is a terribly critical one. You are both the parents of daughters with autism. We typically, Dave, think of this as being about boys. You both are sort of unusual in that experience, but your daughter's 20, which also brings us into kind of a new generation of problems, right?
That's right. And generation of problems, but also generation of opportunity. So, while we are really still focused on early diagnosis and access to therapies and special education, we're as focused now today on employment. Unemployment for adults with autism is 90%. Housing is a huge challenge also, and we are bringing in all our forces to bear to say, what can we do to make a difference there?
Are we still having too much of a fight over what's really behind the bloom, or if you want to call it that, this big increase? Clearly, we're diagnosing more people with autism, so our ability to diagnose it has changed. But we get caught up too much in that side of it, or is that really still a worrisome thing to you?
I think we all want to know the answer. We love to know what's causing this, and is there a possible cure? There's others that are working on that at the national level, National Institute of Health and others. In the meantime, we've got 16,000 plus children in the state of Michigan, and who knows how many adults, 60 to 70, 80,000 adults. That's where our focus is. What can we do to make Michigan a better place to live if you have a child or adult with autism?
In fact, Lieutenant Governor, it's interesting. In 2011, I believe it was, I saw a study that showed that among the worst states to be if you've got a child with autism, Michigan was one of them. Yeah. 4 years, I think it was 4 years later in 2015, Michigan was no longer on that list. So things have changed here quite a bit.
They really have, and the insurance reform is just the beginning of that. Some of the changes that are starting to be brought about in the special education system, along with the employment, disability employment efforts that are happening are really critically important for people with autism. So it's not just the early diagnosis and the therapy, but really creating access and opportunity in the world, being inclusive about the way that we make things happen in schools and in our society. So we're taking steps. We are making improvement overall, but I can tell you we've got a long way to go. And I have to remind myself, though, what it was like in 2010, having this little girl with autism and totally being lost. And where do you go and what do you do and how do you navigate this? And so much has changed since then. It's great. I think it's the time to really celebrate that, but use that as momentum to push us forward to where we need to get.
I've got a brother who has a son who's autistic. I know exactly that path you're talking about, but I want to give you both your opportunity to talk about your personal experience with the frustrations that you've had, not only with how difficult it is to raise a child who's autistic, but also with dealing with the system as it is. Dave, let me start with you.
Well, the system, was maddening when we learned about our daughter. There was not a lot of therapists because there wasn't insurance, so we went and fixed that. The schools were a real challenge, and that's another journey right now, getting evidence-based methods used in the schools, good IEPs, getting these children prepared to become adults and into the workforce. And I give the Lieutenant Governor a lot of credit. He's heading up the task force to reform special education. And then there's sub-projects that we're working on, and one of them this week is working on outlawing seclusion and restraint, which is still used in Michigan with kids with special needs.
Oh, yeah. Lieutenant Governor, your experience. You've written about it a lot on Facebook for people who follow you there.
Sure, and it's there's if there's something that I really want for children like my daughter, it's for people to look at them and see potential. It's really easy to look and see the barriers, to see the struggle, to see the things that are weaknesses or the areas that they have a hard time with, but instead to look beyond that. I mean, all of us have things that we're good at and things that we're bad at. And what type of life would we lead if every room that we walked into, people automatically saw the weakness, or people automatically focused on the things that you struggled with the most? And that's what I want to try and see change, is that we can really see the potential, build around the potential, and celebrate success.
Dave, it's also still, for people who aren't on the inside of it, it's still complicated for them because the spectrum of autism is so vast. You've got high-functioning people who may have Asperger's, down to people who have far more profound challenges. It's difficult and I've got just a few seconds left, but that's part of the problem with dealing with this, right?
Well, part of the problem, but I also think it's the mindset. So when we talk about employment, a lot of times the conversation goes to the lowest functioning child or adult and everything they can't do. And what we're working on is changing the dialogue to say, what can they do? Let's go work on that, find them the right job, and make it a success.
Tell you what, I'd like us to continue our conversation a little bit longer. We're going to move over to clickondetroit.com and talk more about autism, about where we're headed, all of that. I hope you'll join us on clickondetroit.com for that. Over here on the broadcast side, have a great week. We'll see you next time right back here on Flashpoint.